The latex glove slipped from Margaret Thornton's trembling fingers like a dying leaf, hitting the emergency room floor with a whisper that somehow echoed louder than screams. Sarah's gasp cut through the antiseptic air as her eyes locked onto her grandmother's palm, a grotesque purple mass weeping dark fluid, its surface cracked like drought-stricken earth. It wasn't arthritis keeping those gloves on for 11 months. Nurse Patricia stumbled backward, her clipboard clattering against the metal cart as Dr. Morrison's pen froze mid-signature on his prescription pad. The veteran physician who'd seen everything in 20 years of emergency medicine couldn't mask the horror creeping across his weathered face. Margaret's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Please don't look at me like that, sweetheart." But Sarah couldn't look away from the woman who'd raised her. This stranger who'd hidden such agony behind Sunday dinners and gentle smiles. "Get me Dr. Chen." "Now," Morrison commanded, his steady hands betraying him with the slightest tremor. What kind of love makes someone suffer in silence? And how long could she have survived this secret? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 days before that terrible moment in the emergency room, Margaret Elizabeth Thornton sat in her Cleveland kitchen, watching the morning light filter through lace curtains her late husband Robert had hung 15 years ago. At 70, she moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to hide pain behind practiced grace. The house on Maple Street bore the quiet dignity of working-class America. Clean, modest, and filled with memories that whispered from every corner. Margaret had been a force of nature once, an emergency room nurse at Mercy General Hospital for 25 years. Her hands had delivered babies, restarted hearts, and comforted the dying through countless midnight shifts. Those same hands now betrayed her, the left one constantly gloved in thin latex that she explained away with casual mentions of arthritis and cold sensitivity. "Just getting old, dear," she'd tell anyone who asked, though the truth was far more sinister. Sarah Catherine Wellington, 28 and sharp as her grandmother had raised her to be, visited from Chicago every month like clockwork. A marketing executive with her grandmother's stubborn streak and her late grandfather's gentle eyes, Sarah carried guilt like a stone in her chest. Guilt over not calling enough, not staying longer, not seeing what was hiding in plain sight. She'd grown up believing Margaret was her biological grandmother, the only family she'd known after her parents died in a car accident when she was 6. The deception was perfect in its simplicity. Margaret had woven it so seamlessly into their lives that even Sarah's adoptive father, Margaret's supposed son, never questioned the story. Family photos strategically placed, shared memories carefully cultivated, a lifetime of love that made biology irrelevant. Margaret had weathered her husband's sudden heart attack, raised a grieving child, and built a fortress of normalcy around them both. But secrets have weight, and Margaret's had been growing heavier by the day. The medical bills hidden in her bedroom drawer told one story. The jewelry box, gradually emptying, told another. She'd taken a second mortgage on the house 6 months ago, telling no one, selling her grandmother's china piece by piece to collectors on eBay. The woman who'd spent decades caring for others had mastered the art of suffering alone. Her nursing training made the self-diagnosis impossible to ignore. She knew exactly what was growing in her palm, understood the timeline, recognized the symptoms that would eventually overwhelm even her considerable will to hide them. Yet she'd made her choice 11 months ago when the first dark spot appeared. She would protect Sarah from this burden, just as she'd protected her from everything else life had tried to throw at them. Margaret's morning routine included changing the dressing on her hand, a ritual performed in the locked bathroom while coffee percolated downstairs. The mirror reflected a woman who'd taught herself to live with the unthinkable, whose love ran so deep it transformed self-destruction into an act of mercy. She had no idea that in 3 days that love would finally demand the truth. 11 months earlier, Margaret had been deadheading roses in her back garden when she first noticed the small dark spot on her left palm. October in Cleveland carried the crisp promise of winter, and the thorns had been particularly vicious that afternoon, leaving her hand scratched and stinging. She'd dismissed the mark as nothing more than a puncture wound, perhaps a splinter of wood from the old trellis that needed replacing but would have to wait until her fixed income allowed for such luxuries. Probably just a bruise from the rose thorns, she'd muttered to herself, running cool water over her hands at the kitchen sink. The spot was no bigger than a pencil eraser, a deep purple-black that reminded her uncomfortably of the bruises she'd seen on patients during her nursing career. But Margaret Thornton had learned long ago that worry was a luxury she couldn't afford, especially when it came to her own well-being. By Christmas, the spot had doubled in size and taken on a different quality entirely. The skin around it felt tender to the touch, and Margaret found herself unconsciously favoring her right hand when wrapping presents for Sarah's visit. She'd always been meticulous about her appearance, a holdover from her nursing days when presentation mattered as much as competence. But now she found herself reaching for the box of latex gloves she kept under the kitchen sink for cleaning. "Getting particular about germs in my old age," she'd joked to her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd commented on the gloves during their weekly chat over the back fence. The lie came so easily it surprised her, sliding off her tongue with the practiced smoothness of someone who'd learned to protect others from uncomfortable truths. The real turning point came in February, during one of those brutal Cleveland winters that seemed to seep into your bones and take up permanent residence. Sarah had driven up for Margaret's birthday weekend, bringing homemade chocolate cake and stories from her marketing job that Margaret pretended to understand. They'd spent Saturday afternoon looking through old photo albums, Sarah curled up beside her on the worn velvet sofa that had been Robert's favorite spot for watching baseball. "Tell me about your nursing days again, Grandma," Sarah had said, pointing to a faded photograph of Margaret in her starched white uniform, looking impossibly young and confident. "You never talk much about the hospital." Margaret had felt her gloved hand twitch involuntarily. The spot had grown into something she could no longer ignore, a raised mass that sent shooting pains up her arm when she moved wrong. Her nursing training whispered diagnoses she didn't want to hear, medical terms that carried weight she wasn't ready to shoulder. "Oh, sweetheart, those were different times," Margaret had deflected, closing the album with more force than necessary. "Nothing you'd find interesting. Now, how about some tea?" That night, after Sarah had driven back to Chicago, promising to call more often, Margaret had stood in her bathroom examining the thing that was no longer just a spot. Under the harsh fluorescent light, it looked alien, wrong, like something that didn't belong on human skin. She'd worked emergency medicine long enough to know malignancy when she saw it, understood the progression from suspicious mark to aggressive growth. The internet research had been a mistake. Late nights spent hunched over her ancient laptop, medical websites confirming her worst fears with clinical detachment that made her stomach turn. Angiosarcoma. The word sat heavy in her mind like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread into every corner of her carefully constructed life. By spring, the practical concerns had begun to mount alongside the physical ones. The growth made simple tasks increasingly difficult, buttoning her cardigan, opening jars, writing checks for the monthly bills that seemed to grow larger while her fixed income remained stubbornly static. She'd started buying groceries with cash to avoid the embarrassment of fumbling with her debit card at the checkout, the latex gloves drawing curious glances from cashiers too polite to ask direct questions. The financial reality had hit her like a physical blow. Her Medicare wouldn't cover the kind of specialized treatment she'd need, and the supplemental insurance Robert had been so proud of securing had more holes than a fisherman's net when it came to rare conditions. She'd done the math with the cold precision her nursing training had taught her. Treatment would bankrupt them both, destroy Sarah's future for the sake of extending an old woman's life by maybe 6 months. So Margaret had made her choice with the same quiet determination that had carried her through 3 decades of 12-hour shifts and medical emergencies. She'd started liquidating her assets piece by piece, each sale another step deeper into the secret she was constructing around her illness. Robert's coin collection went first, sold to a dealer in Akron who asked no questions and paid in cash. Then her mother's jewelry, the pieces she'd been saving to pass down to Sarah someday. The second mortgage had been the hardest deception to maintain. She'd driven to a bank across town where no one knew her, sitting in the loan officer's sterile cubicle while he explained terms and interest rates with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never had to choose between groceries and medication. The house that had been her security became her lifeline, its equity transformed into a hedge against medical catastrophe that she prayed Sarah would never have to know about. Summer brought new challenges as the growth began to ulcerate, weeping a fluid that stained her gloves and carried an odor she masked with liberal applications of hand lotion. She'd taken to wearing long sleeves even in the heat, claiming her skin was sensitive to sun exposure. The lies were multiplying like cancer cells, each one requiring careful maintenance and constant vigilance. Sarah's visits became exercises in performance art. Margaret would plan activities that kept her granddaughter busy and distracted, cooking elaborate meals, organizing old photographs, tending the garden with studied casualness, while her left hand remained carefully concealed. She'd become an expert at misdirection, guiding conversations away from topics that might reveal her condition while maintaining the gentle authority that had always defined their relationship. The breaking point came on a humid Thursday in late August. Margaret had been trying to open a jar of pickles for lunch when the growth caught against the lid's edge, sending pain shooting up her arm with such intensity that she'd cried out involuntarily. The jar had shattered against the kitchen floor, pickle juice and glass spreading across the linoleum like evidence of her failing facade. For long minutes she'd stood among the debris, her gloved hand pressed against her chest as she tried to catch her breath. The face looking back at her from the kitchen window's reflection was that of a stranger, hollow-eyed, pale, carrying the unmistakable mark of someone living on borrowed time. That's when she'd heard Sarah's key in the front door, her cheerful voice calling out, "Grandma, I brought Chinese food!" Margaret had swept the broken glass into a dustpan with shaking hands, her mind racing through explanations and excuses while her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. The weekend ahead would test every deception she'd constructed, every lie she'd carefully crafted to protect the person she loved most in the world. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of golden light that made Cleveland's autumn feel like a gift from heaven itself. Sarah had surprised Margaret with an impromptu weekend visit, her Chicago apartment suddenly feeling too empty, too far from the woman who'd raised her with such quiet strength. She'd driven through the night, sustained by gas station coffee and the inexplicable need to sit in her grandmother's kitchen, surrounded by the familiar smells of vanilla extract and old wood polish. Margaret had woken to the sound of Sarah's key in the front door, her heart immediately jumping into overdrive as she realized she'd forgotten to set her alarm. The morning routine, changing the dressing, applying fresh gloves, arranging her sleeve to hide any telltale stains, hadn't been completed. Panic seized her throat as she heard footsteps on the creaking stairs. "Grandma, I brought Chinese food for later." Sarah's voice carried the easy happiness of someone who believed in the fundamental goodness of surprise visits and family togetherness. "And I stopped at that bakery you love, the one with the apple turnovers." "Just a minute, sweetheart," Margaret called back, her voice strained with the effort of sounding normal while she frantically pulled on latex gloves with her good hand. The left one protested every movement, the growth having reached a size that made even simple tasks feel like navigating a minefield of potential discovery. By the time she made it downstairs, Sarah had already claimed the kitchen, her laptop open on the worn wooden table while she sorted through grocery bags with the efficient enthusiasm of someone who'd learned organization from watching her grandmother manage a household on determination and careful budgeting. "I thought we could make pancakes," Sarah announced, already pulling ingredients from the pantry with the casual familiarity of someone who'd spent countless weekends in this kitchen. "The way you used to when I was little? Remember how you'd let me flip them even though I always made a mess?" Margaret's chest tightened with something that felt like grief and gratitude twisted together. Here was Sarah, 28 and successful and beautiful, still seeking comfort in childhood rituals, still believing that her grandmother was the strongest person in the world. The weight of maintaining that illusion felt suddenly unbearable. "Of course, dear," Margaret managed, positioning herself carefully at the counter where her left hand would remain largely hidden. "Though my pancake flipping days might be behind me, these old hands aren't as steady as they used to be." Sarah glanced up from measuring flour, her brow furrowing slightly. "You've been saying that a lot lately." "About getting old, I mean. Are you feeling okay? Really okay?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Margaret felt the familiar dance of deception beginning. How many times had she deflected similar inquiries over the past months? How many lies had she wrapped in the comfortable disguise of age-appropriate complaints? "Just tired, sweetheart. You know how it is. Some days I feel every one of my 70 years. She reached for the syrup bottle on the high shelf, a movement so automatic she'd forgotten to think about it until her gloved hand bumped against the cabinet handle. The latex caught on the metal edge, pulling tight against her wrist with a sensation that sent alarm bells through every nerve ending. Margaret tried to adjust her grip, but the glove was stretched taut, the cabinet handle somehow twisted into the material like a fishhook caught in fine fabric. "Grandma, let me get that," Sarah said, moving toward her with the easy grace of someone young enough to believe that all problems could be solved with a little height and determination. "No, I've got it," Margaret protested, but the words came out sharper than intended, carrying the edge of panic she'd been fighting to suppress. The glove pulled tighter, the pressure against the growth sending waves of pain up her arm that made her vision blur at the edges. Sarah stopped mid-step, her hand halfway to the shelf. "Grandma, what's wrong? You look pale." "Nothing's wrong. I'm just—" The cabinet handle gave the glove one final vicious tug, and Margaret felt the latex begin to tear. Time seemed to slow to the consistency of honey as she watched the white material peel away from her skin like old paint flaking from weathered wood. The scream that tore from Sarah's throat seemed to come from another universe entirely. It was the sound of innocence dying, of comfortable assumptions crashing into unthinkable reality. The syrup bottle slipped from Margaret's nerveless fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor in an explosion of amber glass and sticky sweetness. "Grandma!" Sarah's voice cracked on the word, her body frozen in a tableau of horror as she stared at the thing that had been revealed in Margaret's palm. The purple mass seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life, weeping dark fluid that had already begun to stain the torn edges of the glove. Margaret's first instinct was to hide it, to cover the grotesque growth with her right hand and pretend this moment had never happened. But Sarah had seen it now, had looked directly into the secret Margaret had been guarding with her life, and there was no taking back that knowledge. "How long?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the kitchen air like a blade. "How long have you been hiding this?" The question Margaret had been dreading for 11 months hung between them like a physical presence. She could see the wheels turning in Sarah's mind, the mental inventory of all the times she'd noticed something off but dismissed it as the normal eccentricities of aging, the gloves, The favoring of her right hand, the subtle changes in behavior that love had taught Sarah to overlook. "Please don't look at me like that," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking on the words. The look on Sarah's face was everything she'd been trying to avoid. The horror, the pity, the devastating realization that the person she'd counted on to be strong was falling apart in the most literal sense. Like what? Like someone who's been lied to for how long has this been happening? "How long have you been suffering while I sat in Chicago complaining about work stress?" Sarah's voice was rising, years of suppressed worry and guilt crystallizing into anger that had nowhere safe to land. Margaret sank into the nearest chair, cradling her ruined hand against her chest while syrup spread across the floor in golden tributaries. "I didn't want you to worry. You have your own life to live, sweetheart. Your own problems to solve." "My problems?" Sarah's laugh came out harsh and broken. "My biggest problem this week was choosing between two marketing campaigns." "You're talking about... what is that thing? What's wrong with your hand?" The medical terms sat on Margaret's tongue like stones she couldn't swallow. Angiosarcoma. Malignant. Metastasis. Words that would transform this moment from a crisis into a catastrophe, that would shift Sarah's world from its axis into something unrecognizable. "We need to go to the hospital," Sarah said, her marketing training kicking in with the kind of practical crisis management that would have made Margaret proud under different circumstances. "Right now. We're getting in the car and—" "No." The word came out with more force than Margaret had intended. But the thought of exposing her condition to the medical establishment she'd once been part of felt like a betrayal of everything she'd worked to protect. "It's not that simple, dear. The insurance, the costs, the—" "I don't care about costs." Sarah's voice cracked again, and Margaret could see tears starting to track down her cheeks. "You could die from whatever this is. You could already be dying, and I've been sitting in business meetings while you—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Margaret could hear all the words Sarah wasn't saying. "While you suffered alone, while you sold your possessions, while you mortgaged the house, while you chose protecting me over saving yourself." Margaret reached out with her good hand, bridging the space between them with a gesture that had comforted Sarah through skinned knees and broken hearts and all the small tragedies of growing up. "I've seen worse storms than this, sweetheart. We'll figure it out." But even as she said it, Margaret knew that this storm was different. The secret that had protected them both was finally demanding its price, and there was no hiding from the reckoning that was coming. The drive to Mercy General Hospital passed in a blur of tense silence and suppressed panic. Sarah's knuckles were white against the steering wheel as she navigated the familiar streets of Cleveland, her grandmother beside her clutching a blood-stained dish towel around her ruined hand. The autumn afternoon that had begun with such promise now felt heavy with unspoken dread, each mile bringing them closer to answers neither of them was ready to hear. "Turn left at the next light," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying the hollow quality of someone who'd already begun retreating into herself. "The emergency entrance is around back." Sarah shot her a sharp look. "How do you know the layout so well? I thought you said you hardly ever came here anymore." The question hung between them like another secret waiting to be unpacked, but Margaret just pressed her lips together and stared out the passenger window at the sprawling medical complex that had once been the center of her world. 25 years of her life lived within those walls, countless lives saved and lost, and now she was returning as a patient rather than the woman who'd once commanded respect in every corridor. The emergency room's automatic doors opened with a mechanical whisper that seemed unnaturally loud in the afternoon quiet. Sarah guided Margaret to the registration desk where a young nurse looked up from her computer screen with the practiced smile of someone trained to project calm in the face of human suffering. "Name and date of birth, please." the nurse said, her fingers poised over the keyboard with efficient readiness. Margaret Elizabeth Thornton, came the response, followed by a birth date that made the nurse's eyebrows rise slightly. As the details were entered into the system, something shifted in the young woman's expression, a flicker of recognition that made Margaret's stomach clench with anticipation. Thornton, wait, are you Margaret Thornton? The Margaret Thornton who used to work here? The nurse's voice had taken on a different quality, tinged with something that sounded almost like reverence. Margaret nodded reluctantly, feeling Sarah's eyes boring into her with renewed intensity. Another secret revealed, another layer of the careful story she'd constructed beginning to peel away like old wallpaper. Oh my goodness, you trained my supervisor when she was just starting out. She talks about you all the time, says you're the reason she stayed in nursing. The young woman's enthusiasm faltered as she noticed the blood seeping through Margaret's makeshift bandage. What brings you in today, Mrs. Thornton? Before Margaret could deflect the question with some carefully crafted half-truth, Sarah stepped forward with the kind of commanding presence that would have made her grandmother proud under different circumstances. She's been hiding some kind of growth on her hand for almost a year. It's been bleeding and getting worse, and she won't tell me what it is. The nurse's professional demeanor sharpened immediately, her training taking precedence over her star-struck reaction. Let's get you back to a room right away, Mrs. Thornton. Dr. Morrison is on duty today. He'll want to see you personally. As they followed the nurse through corridors that Margaret remembered like the lines on her own palm, Sarah's frustration finally boiled over. How many people here know you? How much of your life have you kept from me? Margaret's response was interrupted by a voice that made her freeze mid-step. Margaret Thornton? Is that really you? They turned to see a woman in her 50s approaching with the brisk walk of someone accustomed to medical emergencies. Patricia Wells had been a fresh-faced nursing student when Margaret was head of emergency services, and now she wore the confident bearing of a woman who'd found her place in the world. Patricia, Margaret managed, her voice tight with the effort of maintaining composure. I didn't know you were still here. 22 years and counting, Patricia replied, her smile fading as she noticed Margaret's condition, though I have to say this isn't how I imagined our reunion. Her gaze moved to Sarah with professional assessment. Family? My granddaughter, Sarah, Margaret said automatically, then felt the familiar weight of that particular deception settling on her shoulders. How many lies would be exposed before this day was over? Patricia's expression grew more serious as she took in the blood-stained towel and Margaret's obvious pain. Margaret, what's going on? You look like you're in considerable distress. It's nothing that can't wait, Margaret began, but Sarah cut her off with a sound of pure exasperation. It's not nothing. She's been hiding some kind of tumor or growth or God knows what for 11 months, and she won't tell me the truth about anything. Sarah's voice cracked with frustration and fear. I don't even know how many other secrets she's keeping from me. The words hit Margaret like physical blows, each one a reminder of how her attempts to protect Sarah had instead created a chasm of mistrust between them. Patricia's professional assessment shifted into a higher gear as she took in the dynamics of the situation, the frightened granddaughter, the secretive patient, the obvious signs of a medical condition that had been neglected for far too long. Let's get you into an examination room, Patricia said with the kind of firm kindness that Margaret remembered from her own nursing days. Dr. Morrison will want to take a look and we'll need to run some tests. The examination room felt smaller than Margaret remembered, its walls closing in as she sat on the paper-covered table while Sarah paced the narrow space like a caged animal. The blood pressure cuff squeezed her arm with mechanical precision, the numbers displayed on the monitor reflecting the stress of months of hidden suffering. When Dr. Morrison entered the room, Margaret felt another piece of her carefully constructed privacy crumble away. James Morrison had been a resident when she was at the peak of her career, a young doctor who'd sought her advice on countless cases. Now he wore the confidence of 20 years in emergency medicine, his hair gray at the temples and his eyes carrying the weight of having seen humanity at its most vulnerable. "Nurse Thornton," he said, and the title carried a warmth that made Margaret's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Patricia tells me you've been keeping secrets from your family." The gentle reproach in his voice was worse than any harsh criticism would have been. Margaret had spent her career advocating for patients to be honest with their families, to face medical realities with courage and openness. Now she was on the receiving end of that advice, and it felt like a betrayal of everything she'd once stood for. "It's complicated, James," she said, reverting to the informal address they'd used during those long-ago night shifts when hierarchy mattered less than getting through another crisis together. "It always is," he replied, pulling on latex gloves with the practiced efficiency she remembered. "But let's start with the basics. Sarah tells me you've been hiding a growth on your hand for almost a year. May I take a look?" The moment of revelation felt inevitable now, like watching a slow-motion car accident unfold. Margaret unwrapped the dish towel with trembling fingers, exposing the grotesque mass that had become the center of her secret universe. The purple, weeping thing seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life under the harsh examination room lights. Dr. Morrison's professional composure slipped for just a moment, his eyes widening slightly before training reasserted itself. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room as she stared at the thing that had been growing in her grandmother's palm while they shared Sunday dinners and gentle conversations about nothing important. "Margaret," Dr. Morrison said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of medical knowledge that couldn't be sugar-coated. "How long has it been ulcerating like this?" "About 3 months," Margaret admitted, feeling Sarah's stare like a physical weight. "Maybe 4. And you didn't seek treatment because—" He left the question hanging, though they all knew the answer involved pride and fear and a stubborn determination to handle things alone. "Because I'm 70 years old and I know what this probably is," Margaret said, with more sharpness than she'd intended. "Because treatment would bankrupt us both and might buy me 6 months if I'm lucky. Because I wanted to protect the people I love from watching me fall apart." Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. "You wanted to protect me by lying to me? By letting me think you were fine while you were—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Margaret could see the wheels turning in her mind, calculating all the signs she'd missed or dismissed. Dr. Morrison was examining the growth with the kind of focused attention that Margaret recognized from her own nursing days. The clinical assessment, the careful probing, the mental checklist of possibilities running through a medical professional's mind when confronted with something serious. "Margaret, I need to be straight with you," he said finally, straightening up to meet her eyes. "This needs immediate attention. We're talking about emergency surgery, possibly tonight, and we're going to need to run extensive tests to determine if it's spread." The word "spread" hit the room like a physical force. Sarah sank into the plastic chair beside the examination table, her face pale as the reality of her grandmother's condition began to sink in. This wasn't just a medical problem that could be solved with some medication and follow-up appointments. This was the kind of crisis that changed everything. "The insurance situation is complicated," Margaret began, but Dr. Morrison waved away her concern with the impatience of someone who'd seen too many patients delay treatment for financial reasons. "We'll figure out the insurance. Right now, I'm more concerned about the fact that you've been walking around with an advanced malignancy for almost a year without treatment." His voice carried the frustration of a medical professional who'd lost patience to pride and fear. "Margaret, you know better than this. You've seen what happens when people wait too long." Patricia appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the tension in the room. "Dr. Morrison, I've got the surgical team on standby and I've called Dr. Chen from oncology. She's on her way down." The word oncology seemed to echo in the small room, confirming what they'd all been thinking but nobody had been willing to say out loud. Margaret felt the last of her protective walls crumbling as the medical machinery began to move around her, unstoppable now that the secret was out. "Grandma," Sarah said, her voice small and lost, "why didn't you trust me enough to tell me? Why didn't you think I was strong enough to help you through this?" The question cut deeper than any scalpel could have. Margaret reached out with her good hand, bridging the space between them with a gesture that had comforted Sarah through every crisis of her young life. But now the roles were reversed, and Margaret was the one who needed comfort, the one whose strength had finally reached its limits. "Because you're the most precious thing in my world," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking on the words, "and I couldn't bear the thought of you watching me become less than the woman you've always believed me to be." Sarah's tears came then, years of suppressed worry and guilt finally finding their release. "You could never be less than everything to me. Don't you understand that? You're my hero, my role model, my—" She stopped herself before saying, "grandmother," but Margaret heard the word anyway, hanging in the air between them like another secret waiting to be revealed. How many more truths would this day demand? How many more carefully constructed lies would crumble before the medical crisis was resolved? Dr. Morrison cleared his throat gently, bringing their attention back to the immediate reality of Margaret's condition. "I hate to interrupt, but we really need to get you prepped for surgery. The longer we wait, the more complicated this becomes." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of inevitability settling around her like a familiar coat. The time for secrets and protection was over. Now there was only the frightening honesty of medical crisis and the hope that love would be strong enough to survive the truth. The pre-operative room buzzed with controlled urgency as medical staff prepared Margaret for what Dr. Morrison had grimly described as exploratory surgery with curative intent. Sarah sat beside the gurney, clutching her grandmother's good hand while watching monitors display vital signs that painted a picture of a body under extraordinary stress. The numbers told their own story: elevated heart rate, irregular blood pressure, oxygen saturation that dipped and climbed like a troubled conscience. "Mrs. Thornton, I need you to understand what we're dealing with here," Dr. Chen said as she entered the room, her oncology credentials lending weight to words that would reshape their world. She was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of focused intensity that came from spending years delivering life-altering diagnoses. "The mass in your palm shows characteristics consistent with angiosarcoma, a rare form of cancer that affects blood vessels." The clinical term hung in the air like a death sentence, and Sarah felt her world tilt sideways as the full implications began to sink in. Cancer. The word she'd been afraid to think, much less say aloud, was now part of their reality with the brutal finality of a judge's gavel. "How rare are we talking about?" Sarah managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "Angiosarcoma accounts for less than 1% of all soft tissue sarcomas," Dr. Chen replied with the practiced delivery of someone who'd learned to present devastating statistics with clinical detachment. "In the hand specifically, it's even rarer. We see maybe one case every few years in a facility this size." Margaret's grip on Sarah's hand tightened slightly, and when Sarah looked at her grandmother's face, she saw something that chilled her more than the cancer diagnosis itself. Margaret wasn't surprised. The shock, the fear, the desperate hope for a different explanation, none of those emotions played across her weathered features. Instead, Sarah saw resignation, acceptance, and something that looked disturbingly like relief. "You knew," Sarah said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "You've known what this was all along." Margaret's eyes met hers with the steady gaze of someone who'd finally been caught in a truth too big to hide. "I suspected. My nursing training. I've seen enough cases to recognize the signs." "Seen enough cases?" Dr. Morrison interjected, looking up from Margaret's chart with a frown of professional concern. Margaret, your file shows you specialized in emergency medicine, not oncology. How much exposure did you have to sarcoma cases? The question seemed innocent enough, but Sarah caught the subtle shift in her grandmother's expression, the way her eyes darted away from direct contact. Another secret. Another carefully guarded piece of information that was about to be dragged into the unforgiving light of medical scrutiny. I worked trauma, Margaret said carefully, her voice carrying the weight of memories she'd spent decades trying to forget. Car accidents, industrial injuries, emergency surgeries. You see things in trauma that don't make it into textbooks. Patricia Wells chose that moment to enter the room with Margaret's surgical consent forms, but she stopped short when she heard the tail end of the conversation. Something flickered across her face. Recognition, perhaps, or the sudden connection of dots that had been waiting years to be joined. "Margaret," Patricia said slowly, her voice carrying a strange quality that made everyone in the room turn to look at her. "When you say trauma cases, are you talking about the Wellington incident?" The name hit the room like a thunderclap. Sarah felt her grandmother's hand go rigid in hers, saw the color drain from Margaret's face with the suddenness of a curtain being drawn. Wellington. Sarah's own last name, the name she'd carried since childhood, the name that connected her to parents she barely remembered, and a tragedy that had shaped her entire life. "What Wellington incident?" Dr. Chen asked, her clinical curiosity overriding the immediate surgical concerns. "Is this relevant to the patient's current condition?" Patricia looked between Margaret and Sarah with the expression of someone who just realized they were standing on the edge of a precipice. "I'm sorry, I thought—" "Margaret, doesn't Sarah know about—" "Know about what?" Sarah's voice came out sharper than she'd intended, but the accumulation of secrets and half-truths had finally pushed her past the point of polite patience. "What don't I know about?" "What else has she been hiding from me?" The machines monitoring Margaret's vital signs began to beep more insistently as her stress levels spiked. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, and sweat broke out across her forehead despite the cool temperature of the pre-operative suite. Dr. Morrison moved quickly to adjust her IV medications, his movements efficient but concerned. "We need to get her stabilized before surgery," he said, but his eyes were on Margaret's face, reading the signs of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. "Margaret, whatever this is about, we can discuss it after the procedure. Right now, I need you to focus on staying calm." "No," Margaret said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "She has a right to know. I've kept too many secrets for too long." She turned to face Sarah directly, her eyes carrying the weight of 22 years of carefully maintained deception. "Sarah, honey, you need to understand something about the night your parents died." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying with them the promise of revelations that would change everything Sarah thought she knew about her own history. The car accident that had killed her parents when she was 6 years old was the foundational trauma of her life, the event that had brought her into Margaret's care and created the family structure she'd never questioned. "What about that night?" Sarah asked, though part of her was already bracing for an answer she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. Margaret's grip on her hand tightened as if she were anchoring herself to the present moment. "I wasn't just any nurse on duty that night, sweetheart. I was the trauma nurse who responded when they brought you in. You and your parents, after the accident on Interstate 77. The revelation hit Sarah like ice water, shocking and disorienting. She'd always known that Margaret had been working at the hospital when her parents died, had understood in a vague way that this connection had led to her adoption by Margaret's family. But the specifics had always been wrapped in the gentle vagueness that adults use to protect children from harsh realities. "You were there?" Sarah whispered, her mind struggling to process this new information. "You actually treated us?" "I treated you," Margaret corrected gently. "Your parents." They were beyond help by the time the ambulance arrived. But you had a chance. You were trapped in the back seat, and there was a fire starting in the engine compartment. Patricia Wells nodded slowly, her own memories of that night apparently still vivid after more than 2 decades. It was the talk of the hospital for weeks. Margaret crawled into that wreckage to get to you, even though the fire department said it was too dangerous. She pulled you out with her bare hands. Sarah's world seemed to tilt on its axis as the implications of this revelation began to sink in. Margaret hadn't just been a nurse who happened to be on duty when tragedy struck. She had been the person who physically saved Sarah's life, who had risked her own safety to pull a terrified 6-year-old from a burning car. "That's how you hurt your hand," Sarah said, the pieces suddenly clicking into place with horrible clarity. "The thing growing there, it's connected to that night, isn't it?" Margaret's nod was barely perceptible, but it confirmed what Sarah had already begun to suspect. The cancer wasn't just a random medical catastrophe. It was connected to the moment that had brought them together, a delayed consequence of the heroic act that had saved Sarah's life. "There was glass everywhere," Margaret explained, her voice distant with memory. "Shattered windshield, broken bottles from the wreckage. I had to reach through it to get to you, and something, a piece of metal maybe, or glass, cut deep into my palm. It healed wrong, left a scar that never quite went away." Dr. Chen leaned forward with renewed interest, her oncologist's training focusing on the medical implications of this revelation. Foreign material embedded in tissue can sometimes trigger cellular changes years later, if there was glass or metal fragments left in the wound. "It could cause a sarcoma 22 years down the road," Dr. Morrison finished grimly. "Margaret, why didn't you mention this connection earlier? This changes our entire approach to treatment." But Sarah was still processing the emotional implications of what she'd learned. Margaret hadn't just been a caring nurse who'd taken in an orphaned child out of professional obligation or family connection. She had literally pulled Sarah from the wreckage of her old life, had risked her own body to save a stranger's child, and had then spent the next 22 years raising that child as her own. "You're not my grandmother," Sarah said, the words coming out as a statement rather than a question. "You're the person who saved my life." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "I became your grandmother the moment I decided to love you, sweetheart. Blood doesn't make family, choice does. And I chose you that night in the emergency room when you were so small and scared and had nowhere else to go." The monitors around them continued their electronic symphony of vital signs and medical alerts, but Sarah barely heard them. She was remembering fragments of that terrible night, flashes of light, the sound of breaking glass, and through it all, a voice telling her everything would be okay. Margaret's voice, she realized now. The voice of the woman who had literally given pieces of her body to save Sarah's life, and who was now paying the ultimate price for that sacrifice. "The cancer," Sarah whispered, understanding flooding through her like a cold tide. "You got cancer, saving my life." Margaret squeezed her hand with what strength she had left. "And I'd do it again, sweetheart. Every single time, I'd make the same choice. You were worth every risk, every sacrifice, every secret I've kept to protect you." Dr. Morrison cleared his throat gently, bringing their attention back to the immediate medical reality. "This information actually helps us understand the pathology better. We'll need to look for foreign material during the surgery, and we'll have a better idea of what we're dealing with. But right now, we really need to get Margaret into the operating room." Sarah nodded through her tears, understanding that the revelations would have to wait, while medical necessity took precedence. But as they wheeled Margaret toward surgery, she knew that nothing would ever be the same between them. The woman she'd called grandmother for 22 years was actually something far more extraordinary. A hero who had risked everything for a stranger's child and had spent 2 decades loving her as if she were blood-born family. The cancer that threatened to take Margaret away was a direct result of the sacrifice that had brought them together, and that terrible irony would haunt every moment of the long night ahead. The surgical waiting room at Mercy General had the kind of institutional lighting that made everyone look like they were dying, which struck Sarah as particularly cruel given the circumstances. She'd been pacing the same path between the coffee machine and the window overlooking the hospital parking lot for 3 hours, her phone buzzing intermittently with text messages from concerned friends and co-workers that she couldn't bring herself to answer. The surgery had been scheduled to take 4 hours. It had now been 7. Patricia Wells had stayed with her through the first few hours, filling in the gaps of Margaret's story with the kind of professional detachment that made the heroic sound routine. Margaret had crawled into that burning car without hesitation, Patricia explained, ignoring direct orders from the fire chief who'd deemed the vehicle too unstable to approach. She'd cut herself free from twisted metal that had trapped her arm while she pulled an unconscious 6-year-old to safety, never once complaining about her injuries while she stabilized Sarah in the emergency room. She never even filed for workers' compensation, Patricia had said, shaking her head with the wonder of someone still amazed by human selflessness after decades in healthcare. When administration asked about her hand injury, she said it was minor and would heal on its own. Classic Margaret, never wanting to be a burden, even when she was the one who deserved help. Now Patricia was gone, called away to handle her own cases, and Sarah was left alone with the terrible mathematics of modern medicine. 7 hours meant complications. 7 hours meant the kind of discoveries that changed 4-hour procedures into all-day ordeals. 7 hours meant that the thing growing in Margaret's hand had been worse than anyone anticipated. The financial counselor had found her around hour 5, a well-meaning woman in her 50s who spoke in the gentle euphemisms that healthcare professionals used when discussing the intersection of medicine and money. Margaret's insurance would cover basic treatment, she'd explained, but the kind of extensive reconstructive surgery that might be required could easily reach 6 figures. There were payment plans, charity care options, ways to make the unbearable slightly more manageable. Sarah had signed every form without reading them, her mind too fractured to process the details of medical debt and financial ruin. Margaret had spent a year selling her belongings and mortgaging her home to avoid exactly this conversation, and now Sarah was authorizing expenses that would bankrupt them both without a second thought. The irony wasn't lost on her. Margaret's attempt to protect her from financial hardship had simply delayed the inevitable while making it exponentially worse. The waiting room had cycled through dozens of other families over the course of the day. Anxious spouses, worried children, entire extended families camping out with coolers full of sandwiches and thermoses of coffee. Sarah watched them come and go with the detached fascination of someone whose own crisis had reached a level where other people's emergencies seemed almost quaint by comparison. Around hour 6, she'd started making phone calls. First to Margaret's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd promised to water the plants and collect the mail. Then to her own supervisor in Chicago, explaining that she'd need extended time off for a family medical emergency. The conversation had been awkward. How do you explain that your grandmother isn't really your grandmother, but is actually the stranger who saved your life 22 years ago and is now dying of cancer caused by the heroic act that created your family? Take all the time you need, her supervisor had said with the kind of corporate compassion that was genuine but necessarily limited. Family comes first. Family. The word had taken on new weight over the course of this terrible day. Sarah had always understood her family history in broad strokes. Parents died in car accident, kind grandmother took her in, love and stability followed. The details had seemed unimportant when viewed through the lens of a childhood made secure by Margaret's unwavering devotion. Now those details were everything, the foundation upon which her entire understanding of herself was built. Margaret wasn't her biological grandmother. Margaret wasn't even related to her by blood or marriage or any of the traditional ties that bound families together. Margaret was something else entirely, a stranger who had chosen love over safety, sacrifice over self-preservation, a lifetime of quiet heroism over the easier path of professional detachment. The revelation should have felt like losing her family, Sarah realized. Instead, it felt like discovering that her family was even more extraordinary than she'd ever imagined. The woman who'd raised her hadn't been fulfilling some biological obligation or honoring some pre-existing family bond. She had simply looked at a terrified, orphaned child and decided that love was a choice she was willing to make every single day for the next 22 years. When Dr. Morrison finally emerged from the surgical suite, his scrubs were stained with the kind of evidence that made Sarah's stomach clench with dread. His face carried the exhausted satisfaction of someone who'd spent hours fighting a battle with uncertain outcome, and the surgical mask hanging around his neck bore traces of the war he'd been waging inside Margaret's body. "Sarah," he said, settling into the chair beside her with the careful movements of someone whose back had been bent over an operating table for the better part of a day. "I'm sorry it took so long. What we found in there was more complicated than we'd anticipated." The words hit her like physical blows, each one confirming her worst fears about what 7 hours in surgery might mean. "Is she alive?" "She's alive," Dr. Morrison confirmed quickly, and Sarah felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. "But I won't lie to you. It was touch and go for a while. The mass had grown into the tendons and small bones of her hand, and there were fragments of glass embedded so deeply we needed a specialist to extract them safely. Glass from the car accident." Even 22 years later, the night that had brought them together was still trying to tear them apart. Sarah closed her eyes, seeing in her mind's eye a young Margaret crawling into burning wreckage, cutting her hands on twisted metal and shattered glass to pull a stranger's child to safety. "The pathology will take a few days to confirm," Dr. Morrison continued. "But the good news is that we were able to achieve clean margins. We removed the entire mass and about 2 centimeters of surrounding tissue. Her hand function will be limited, but she should retain basic grip strength and mobility." Sarah nodded, trying to process the medical terminology through the fog of exhaustion and emotional overload. Clean margins meant they'd gotten all the cancer. Limited function meant Margaret would live with permanent reminders of the sacrifice she'd made. It seemed like a cruel equation. The hand that had saved Sarah's life would never work the same way again. "There's something else," Dr. Morrison said, his voice taking on a different quality that made Sarah look up sharply. "Something we found during the surgery that I think you should know about." Sarah's heart began to race again, her mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios, metastasis, spread to other organs, the kind of discoveries that transform successful surgeries into temporary victories in ultimately losing wars. What kind of something? Dr. Morrison pulled out his phone and scrolled through what appeared to be surgical photographs. "The glass fragments we removed, they weren't random debris from the accident. One of them had been worked into a specific shape, almost like someone had tried to fashion it into something recognizable." He turned the phone toward her, showing an image of tiny glass shards arranged on a surgical tray. Even through the medical photography and the distortion of being embedded in tissue for over 2 decades, Sarah could make out what looked like the letter S crafted from a piece of windshield glass. "She carried a piece of your family's car in her hand for 22 years, Dr. Morrison explained quietly. "And somehow, maybe unconsciously, she'd worked it into the shape of your initial. The body had formed scar tissue around it in such a way that it created a kind of memorial, I suppose. like she was carrying a piece of that night with her every single day. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Margaret hadn't just carried the medical consequences of saving her life. She'd literally carried a piece of Sarah's original family embedded in her flesh, a daily reminder of the choice she'd made to love a stranger's child. The cancer that was trying to kill her had grown around this talisman, this physical manifestation of the sacrifice that had created their unconventional family. "Can I see her?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's still in recovery, but yes. I should warn you, though, she's going to be groggy from the anesthesia for a while." And her hand, he gestured vaguely, indicating the extensive surgical modifications that would be immediately visible. Sarah nodded, understanding that Margaret would emerge from this surgery forever changed, marked by the visible consequences of the heroic choice she'd made 2 decades ago. But she was alive. Against all odds, despite a year of hiding her condition and 7 hours of complicated surgery, Margaret Thornton was alive. As Dr. Morrison led her toward the recovery wing, Sarah realized that this was just the beginning. The surgery had saved Margaret's life, but it had also revealed truths that would require them to rebuild their relationship from the ground up. They weren't grandmother and granddaughter. They were hero and survivor, connected by a bond that was deeper than blood and stronger than biology. The woman waiting in that recovery room wasn't the person Sarah had grown up thinking she was. She was something far more extraordinary, a stranger who had chosen to become family, who had carried the physical and emotional scars of that choice for 22 years, and who had nearly died protecting Sarah from the truth of her own heroism. Now it was Sarah's turn to make a choice, to accept the complicated reality of their relationship, or to retreat into the simpler fiction that Margaret had worked so hard to maintain. As she walked down the hospital corridor toward an uncertain future, Sarah knew there was really no choice at all. Margaret had saved her life twice now, once from a burning car and once from a lifetime of not knowing what true selfless love looked like. The recovery room was dimly lit, filled with the soft beeping of monitors and the whispered conversations of nurses checking on post-surgical patients. Margaret lay in the narrow bed, looking smaller than Sarah had ever seen her, her left hand wrapped in layers of white gauze that made it appear twice its normal size. The woman who had always seemed invincible, who had weathered every storm with quiet dignity, looked fragile in a way that made Sarah's chest tighten with protective instinct. "Grandma?" Sarah whispered, settling into the chair beside the bed. The word felt different now, weighted with new meaning. Not grandmother by blood or marriage, but something deeper, chosen family, forged in fire and sustained by 2 decades of unwavering devotion. Margaret's eyes fluttered open, still cloudy from anesthesia but focusing with obvious effort on Sarah's face. Her lips moved soundlessly for a moment before she managed to form words. "Did they tell you everything?" The question carried such weight that Sarah had to take a moment before answering. Everything. The car accident, the heroic rescue, the glass embedded in Margaret's hand for 22 years, the cancer that had grown around a piece of Sarah's original family car, everything that made their relationship simultaneously more complex and more beautiful than Sarah had ever imagined. "They told me about the glass," Sarah said softly. "About how you shaped it into my initial. About how you've been carrying a piece of that night with you all these years." Margaret's good hand moved slightly on the hospital blanket, and Sarah reached out to cover it with her own. The connection felt electric with new understanding, charged with the knowledge of what this woman had sacrificed to give Sarah a life worth living. "I never meant for you to find out like this," Margaret whispered, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed hours earlier. "I wanted to protect you from the truth about that night, about how your real family—" "My real family is right here," Sarah interrupted, squeezing Margaret's hand gently. "You are my real family. You've been my real family since the moment you pulled me out of that car. Blood doesn't make family, Grandma. You taught me that, even if you didn't realize it at the time. Tears slipped down Margaret's cheeks, leaving silver tracks against her pale skin. I was so scared you'd feel obligated to stay with me out of gratitude instead of love. I didn't want you to know about the sacrifice because I didn't want it to change how you saw our relationship. Sarah felt her own tears beginning to flow as the full magnitude of Margaret's fears became clear. For 22 years, Margaret had lived with the secret of her heroism, terrified that revealing the truth would somehow diminish the authentic love they'd built together. She'd carried the physical and emotional scars of that night in silence, protecting Sarah not just from trauma, but from the burden of feeling indebted to her savior. "You think I could love you less because you saved my life?" Sarah asked, incredulity creeping into her voice. "You think knowing about your sacrifice would make our family feel less real somehow?" Margaret's eyes searched Sarah's face with desperate hope. "I just wanted you to have a normal childhood, a normal family, not some complicated story about obligation and debt and heroism," Sarah finished firmly. "And choosing love over safety, and becoming a mother to a stranger's child because it was the right thing to do. Grandma, learning the truth doesn't make me feel obligated to you. It makes me understand how extraordinary you are." The monitors around them continued their electronic symphony, measuring vital signs that told the story of a body healing from major surgery. But Sarah could see something else healing in Margaret's eyes, a wound that had been festering for 2 decades, the fear that their love was somehow artificial or unsustainable once the truth was revealed. "I need to tell you something else," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength as she prepared to voice the decision she'd made during those long hours in the surgical waiting room. "I'm moving back to Cleveland. Permanently." Margaret's eyes widened despite her medication-induced drowsiness. "Sarah, no. You have a career in Chicago, a life you've built for yourself. I won't let you sacrifice your future to take care of an old woman who raised me to be strong enough to make my own choices," Sarah interrupted with gentle firmness. "Who taught me that family takes care of each other no matter what? Who showed me every single day what love looks like when it's backed up by action instead of just words?" She leaned forward, making sure Margaret could see the certainty in her eyes. "This isn't sacrifice, Grandma. This is coming home. This is choosing family the same way you chose me 22 years ago." Margaret tried to protest, but Sarah could see the relief flooding her features despite her words. The fear of being alone, of facing recovery and whatever came next without family support, had been another burden she'd been carrying in silence. The fear of being a burden had kept her from asking for help, even as her world crumbled around her. "Besides," Sarah continued with a small smile, "someone needs to make sure you don't hide any more medical conditions from your family. Someone needs to drive you to follow-up appointments and physical therapy and make sure you're taking your medications. Someone needs to help you relearn how to use that hand once it heals." The mention of her injured hand brought Margaret's attention to the heavily bandaged limb. She flexed her fingers slightly, testing the sensation and mobility that remained after the extensive surgery. Pain flickered across her face, but also something that might have been wonder. "Dr. Morrison said they got it all," Margaret said, her voice carrying cautious hope. "Clean margins, no sign of spread to other areas." Sarah nodded, feeling some of the crushing weight of fear begin to lift from her chest. "He said your hand function will be limited, but not gone. You'll have to relearn some things, but you'll be able to do most of what you did before." "Not everything," Margaret said with a rueful smile. "My rose gardening days are probably over. I won't be able to grip the pruning shears the way I used to." "Then I'll learn to garden," Sarah replied without hesitation. "You can teach me, supervise from a chair while I do the heavy lifting. We'll adapt." The word "we" seemed to resonate in the quiet room, carrying with it the promise of a shared future that neither of them had been certain would exist just hours earlier. Margaret had spent a year preparing to die alone, convinced that revealing her condition would burden Sarah with guilt and obligation. Now she was facing the possibility of not just survival, but of a relationship rebuilt on honesty and mutual choice. "There's going to be a lot to figure out," Margaret said quietly. "The medical bills, the house, your job situation. I've made such a mess of our finances trying to handle this on my own." Sarah squeezed her hand gently. "We'll figure it out together. That's what families do. They figure things out together. No more secrets. No more protecting me from difficult realities. We're partners in this from now on." A nurse appeared in the doorway, checking her watch with the practiced timing of someone managing multiple post-surgical patients. "I'm sorry, but visiting hours are almost over. Margaret needs her rest, and you look like you could use some sleep yourself." Sarah looked at her watch, startled to realize it was nearly midnight. The day that had begun with such promise, pancakes and family stories and the comfortable routines of their relationship, had stretched into a marathon of revelations and medical crises that left her feeling emotionally and physically exhausted. "I'll be back first thing in the morning," she promised Margaret, leaning down to kiss her forehead with the gentle care of someone handling something precious. "And every morning after that until they spring you from this place." Margaret's eyes were already beginning to close as the pain medications pulled her toward sleep. But she managed one more whispered question. "Sarah, are you sure about this? About staying? About everything changing?" Sarah paused in the doorway, looking back at the woman who had saved her life twice, once from a burning car, and once from a lifetime of not understanding what unconditional love looked like. Margaret lay surrounded by monitors and medical equipment, her life forever altered by a heroic choice she'd made 22 years ago, and Sarah felt nothing but overwhelming gratitude for the randomness that had brought them together. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said softly. "You chose me when I was 6 years old and had nothing to offer but need and grief. Now I'm choosing you back. That's what family does. We choose each other over and over again until choosing becomes as natural as breathing." Margaret's smile was the last thing Sarah saw before the nurse dimmed the lights and ushered her toward the elevator. As she walked through the hospital corridors toward an uncertain but hopeful future, Sarah realized that this terrible day had given her something she'd never known she was missing: the truth about where she came from, and more importantly, a clear understanding of what family really meant. The woman sleeping in that recovery room wasn't her biological grandmother, but she was something far more extraordinary. She was the stranger who had chosen to become family, who had carried the scars of that choice for 22 years, and who had nearly died protecting Sarah from the burden of her own heroism. Now it was Sarah's turn to be the hero. 2 months after the surgery, Margaret's kitchen had been transformed into something that looked like mission control for a small-scale recovery operation. Physical therapy schedules were taped to the refrigerator alongside appointment cards for oncology follow-ups, wound care instructions, and a carefully maintained chart tracking Margaret's progress with hand exercises. Sarah had moved back from Chicago with the efficiency of someone who'd finally found her true purpose, trading her marketing career for a position as patient advocate at Mercy General Hospital, a job that felt less like work and more like a calling. The morning sunlight streamed through the same lace curtains that Robert had hung 15 years earlier, but everything else about the house had been subtly modified to accommodate Margaret's new limitations. Jar openers in every drawer, ergonomic handles on kitchen utensils, a raised garden bed that Margaret could tend from a seated position without straining her healing hand, These adaptations had been Sarah's project during the long weeks of Margaret's recovery, each modification a small act of love designed to preserve independence while acknowledging changed circumstances. "The physical therapist says you're ahead of schedule," Sarah announced as she entered the kitchen, carrying grocery bags and wearing the kind of satisfied expression that came from successfully navigating the morning errands that had become their shared routine. "Dr. Morrison wants to see you next week, but he's expecting to release you to normal activities." Margaret looked up from the morning newspaper, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose in a gesture so familiar it made Sarah's heart ache with gratitude for the simple fact of her grandmother's continued existence. The heavy surgical bandages had been replaced weeks ago with a thin, elastic support that allowed Margaret to use her hand for most daily activities, though she still moved with the careful deliberation of someone relearning the boundaries of her own body. "Normal activities," Margaret repeated with a wry smile. "I'm not sure anything about our lives qualifies as normal anymore." She wasn't wrong. The revelation of their true relationship had rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, affecting every aspect of their daily existence in ways both large and small. Sarah's adoptive father, the man she'd grown up believing was Margaret's son, had finally explained the elaborate fiction they'd all maintained to give her a sense of conventional family structure. Margaret had never been married to his father. She'd simply been the nurse who'd saved Sarah's life and then insisted on staying involved in her care until legal adoption could be arranged. "I got a call from Channel 5, Sarah said as she unpacked groceries, arranging items with the kind of systematic efficiency that Margaret recognized as an inherited trait, though they both knew now that inheritance had nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with learned behaviors and shared values. "They want to do a follow-up story on your recovery, something about how the community fundraising campaign helped cover your medical expenses." The media attention had been unexpected and overwhelming. Patricia Wells had mentioned Margaret's story to a local reporter, and within days the narrative of the retired nurse who'd developed cancer from glass embedded during a heroic rescue had captured the imagination of Cleveland's local news cycle. The GoFundMe campaign that Sarah had reluctantly established had raised over $200,000, enough to cover not just the surgical expenses but also to pay off the second mortgage that Margaret had been hiding and to establish a small emergency fund for future medical needs. "I still can't believe strangers donated money to help us," Margaret said, shaking her head with the wonder of someone who'd spent her career helping others without expecting recognition or reward. "All those people who don't even know us, sending checks and writing notes about how my story inspired them to check on elderly family members or pursue careers in healthcare." Sarah smiled as she remembered some of the letters that had poured in from across the country. Former patients who'd tracked down Margaret's address to thank her for care received decades earlier. Young nursing students who'd been inspired by her example to specialize in emergency medicine. Families who'd recognized their own stories in the narrative of chosen love and quiet heroism that had defined Margaret's life. "You're famous now, Grandma. The local newspaper wants to interview you for their Heroes Among Us series, and the nursing school at Case Western wants you to speak to their graduating class about emergency medicine and patient advocacy." Margaret's expression grew thoughtful as she considered these invitations. For 70 years, she'd lived a life of deliberate modesty, avoiding recognition and deflecting praise with the practiced humility of someone who'd never seen her own actions as particularly noteworthy. The idea of being celebrated as a hero still felt foreign to her, though she was beginning to understand that her story had resonated with people because it reminded them of the extraordinary potential that existed within ordinary choices. "Maybe the nursing school," she said finally. "If I can help even one young nurse understand the importance of going beyond the minimum requirements, of seeing patients as whole people rather than just medical cases, then I suppose it would be worth facing a room full of strangers." The transformation in Margaret over these 2 months had been remarkable to witness. The woman who'd hidden her medical condition for a year rather than burden others with her problems was slowly learning to accept help, to acknowledge her own needs, and to recognize that her story had value beyond her immediate family. The process hadn't been easy. Decades of self-reliance couldn't be undone overnight. But Sarah could see her grandmother growing more comfortable with the idea that heroism was worth celebrating rather than hiding. "Dr. Morrison called yesterday," Sarah mentioned casually as she started preparations for lunch. "He wanted me to tell you that the pathology report on the tissue samples came back completely clear. No remaining cancer cells, no sign of any abnormal growth. You're officially in remission." Margaret's hand stilled on her coffee cup, the weight of those words settling over her like a blanket of relief she'd been afraid to hope for. Remission. The word that cancer patients dreamed of hearing, the medical term that meant the difference between borrowed time and genuine future. Sarah had been waiting for the right moment to share this news, wanting to savor the expression of pure joy that spread across Margaret's weathered features. "Remission," Margaret repeated softly, as if testing the word's validity. "I'm actually going to live through this. You're going to live through this, and you're going to see me graduate from the patient advocacy program, and you're going to be there when I get married someday, and you're going to meet your great-grandchildren, biological or adopted, doesn't matter, and you're going to tell them stories about their remarkable great-grandmother who saved lives for a living." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears this time, tears of gratitude rather than fear or pain. "I never let myself imagine a future beyond the surgery. For almost a year, I was just trying to get through each day without you discovering what I was hiding. The idea that I might actually have years left, that we might have time to build something new together." "We have all the time in the world," Sarah said firmly, "and we're going to use it wisely. No more secrets, no more protecting each other from difficult truths. We're going to face whatever comes next as partners, as equals, as the family we chose to become." Margaret nodded, wiping away tears with her good hand while flexing the fingers of her healing left hand in a gesture that had become unconscious habit. The physical therapy was working. She could grip objects securely, write legibly, perform most of the daily tasks that independent living required. The scar tissue would always limit some fine motor control, but she was learning to adapt, to find new ways of accomplishing familiar tasks. "I've been thinking about something," Margaret said as Sarah joined her at the kitchen table with their lunch. "About the house, about our future plans. This place is too big for 2 people, and the maintenance is getting harder for me to handle alone." Sarah felt a flutter of concern. "Are you thinking about selling? Moving to a retirement community?" "I'm thinking about renovating," Margaret replied with a smile that carried hints of the determined woman she'd been during her nursing career. "Converting the upstairs into a separate apartment, making the downstairs fully accessible. That way you can have your own space when you want privacy, but we'll still be close enough to help each other when we need it." The proposal made perfect sense, practical, economical, and designed to preserve both independence and connection. But Sarah could see the deeper meaning behind the suggestion. Margaret was planning for a shared future, making decisions based on the assumption that they would grow old together, that their chosen family would continue to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances. "I love it," Sarah said without hesitation. "We could use some of the fundraising money for the renovations, make this place work for both of us for the long term." Margaret reached across the table with her healing hand, covering Sarah's fingers with her own in a gesture that had comforted and connected them through countless shared meals over the years. The physical contact felt different now, charged with the knowledge of everything this hand had endured, everything it had sacrificed, everything it represented about the nature of chosen love. 22 years ago, I pulled you out of a burning car because I couldn't stand the thought of a child dying alone," Margaret said quietly. I never imagined that decision would give me the greatest gift of my life. You saved me right back, sweetheart. You saved me from a lifetime of loneliness, from growing old without purpose, from never understanding what it means to love someone completely. Sarah squeezed her grandmother's hand gently, feeling the slight roughness of scar tissue beneath her fingers, evidence of heroism worn like a badge of honor. We saved each other. That's what families do. Outside the kitchen window, Margaret's roses were beginning their autumn bloom, tended now by Sarah's careful hands under Margaret's expert supervision. The flowers were different from the ones that had been growing there 2 months ago, but they were no less beautiful for having been planted by different hands, like their family, like their future. Like the love that had sustained them through crisis and revelation, the roses were proof that beautiful things could grow from the most unlikely beginnings. Margaret's story reminds us that the most profound love often comes disguised as ordinary moments. A stranger choosing to crawl into danger for a child, decades of quiet sacrifice hidden behind Sunday dinners, the courage to let others care for us when we've spent a lifetime being the caregiver. For those of us who've reached the season of life where we worry about being burdens rather than blessings, Margaret's journey reveals a beautiful truth. Our worth isn't diminished by needing help, and the families we've built through choice and love are often stronger than those bound only by blood. The glass embedded in her hand became a symbol of how our deepest wounds can transform into sources of connection and purpose. Sometimes the very experiences that leave us scarred are the ones that prepare us to love most deeply. In a culture that often makes older adults feel invisible or irrelevant, Margaret discovered that her story of sacrifice and resilience inspired an entire community. Our lives matter not because we're perfect or invincible, but because we've chosen to love fiercely despite the cost. Reflection. Questions. What glass from your past sacrifices has become a source of strength in your relationships today? How has someone's ordinary act of love profoundly shaped your life in ways they might never realize? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. 1 year later, the auditorium at Case Western Reserve University's nursing school buzzed with the nervous energy of soon-to-be graduates and their proud families. Sarah sat in the front row, her phone positioned to capture every moment of Margaret's keynote address to the class of 2026. The woman standing at the podium bore little resemblance to the frightened, secretive patient who'd been wheeled into emergency surgery 13 months earlier. Margaret's silver hair was styled with the kind of careful attention she'd neglected during her months of illness, and her left hand, still bearing the faint scars of life-saving surgery, moved with confident purpose as she gestured to emphasize her points. Nursing is not a job, Margaret's clear voice carried across the packed auditorium. It's a calling to see the extraordinary within the ordinary, to recognize that every patient who comes through your doors carries a story worth preserving, a life worth fighting for, even when they can't fight for themselves. The speech had taken weeks to prepare, with Sarah helping Margaret craft words that would capture 47 years of nursing wisdom without sounding like a lecture from a bygone era. They'd practiced in the renovated kitchen of their shared home, Margaret growing more confident with each rehearsal as she found ways to connect her experiences to the challenges facing modern healthcare professionals. I want to tell you about a night 23 years ago, Margaret continued, her voice taking on the storytelling cadence that had always made her such a compelling presence during family dinners. A night when I made a choice that changed 2 lives forever, though I didn't understand the full implications until recently. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as Margaret began recounting the story of the Wellington car accident, But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pride for the woman who'd finally learned to see her own heroism as worthy of celebration, who'd discovered that sharing her story could inspire others to find their own capacity for extraordinary love. The renovation of their Maple Street house had been completed 6 months earlier, transforming the old Victorian into a perfect intergenerational living space. Margaret occupied the main floor, which had been modified with grab bars, ramps, and other accessibility features that honored both her age and the lingering effects of her surgery. Sarah's apartment upstairs provided privacy and independence while keeping them close enough to share meals, evening conversations, and the comfortable routines that had sustained their relationship for over 2 decades. The financial windfall from the community fundraising campaign had done more than just cover medical expenses and home renovations. Margaret had insisted on establishing a scholarship fund for nursing students at Mercy General, ensuring that her story would continue to impact healthcare for generations to come. The Margaret Thornton Emergency Nursing Scholarship was awarded annually to students who demonstrated both clinical excellence and the kind of compassionate patient advocacy that had defined Margaret's career. "The young woman sitting in the front row today," Margaret said, gesturing towards Sarah with obvious affection, "was that 6-year-old child I pulled from a burning car." But she became something far more important than a successful rescue. She became my daughter, my purpose, my reminder that the families we choose are often stronger than the families we're born into. The audience erupted in spontaneous applause, and Sarah felt the familiar flutter of amazement that Margaret's story never failed to evoke. Even after hearing it dozens of times, she was still moved by the simple fact of their connection, the randomness of tragedy that had led to such profound love. Dr. Morrison, who was receiving an honorary degree at the same ceremony, had become something of a regular visitor to their home over the past year. What had begun as professional follow-up visits had evolved into something that looked suspiciously like courtship, though both Margaret and James insisted they were just good friends, despite the obvious affection that sparked between them whenever they were in the same room. "He brings her flowers every Sunday," Sarah had confided to Patricia Wells during one of their frequent coffee dates, "and she spends an hour getting ready for his visits, even though she pretends it's just coincidence that she looks so nice when he arrives." Patricia had laughed with the delight of someone watching a romantic comedy unfold in real life. After everything she's been through, Margaret deserves a little happiness, and James has been alone since his wife died 3 years ago. Maybe they're exactly what each other needs. The possibility of romance in Margaret's life had initially felt strange to Sarah, but she'd come to appreciate the way Dr. Morrison's presence seemed to energize her grandmother. Margaret laughed more during his visits, told stories from her nursing days with renewed animation, and had even started taking ballroom dancing lessons at the community center. Partly for the physical therapy benefits, she claimed, but mostly because James had mentioned his love of swing dancing. "My point," Margaret continued her address to the nursing graduates, "is that you never know which moment will define your career, which patient will become family, which choice will echo through decades of consequences you can't imagine. But if you approach every shift with the understanding that you're not just treating symptoms, you're touching lives, shaping futures, sometimes literally saving the people who will become your greatest gifts, then you'll find that nursing gives back far more than it takes." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her former supervisor in Chicago. "Watching the live stream. Your grandmother is incredible. I'm so proud of you both." The message was one of dozens she'd received throughout the day as word spread about Margaret's speech. Social media had amplified their story beyond Cleveland, turning Margaret into something of an internet sensation among healthcare professionals who shared clips of her remarks with hashtags like #ChoseFamily and #NursingHeroes. The attention still felt surreal to Sarah, who'd spent most of her life thinking of Margaret as simply the woman who'd raised her with such quiet competence. Now she watched strangers approach Margaret after speaking engagements, saw young nurses seek her advice on patient care, witnessed the ripple effects of a story that had started with one woman's decision to risk everything for a stranger's child. "As you begin your careers," Margaret said, approaching the conclusion of her address, "remember that healing isn't just about medical interventions. It's about seeing people in their wholeness, understanding that every patient is someone's most precious person, and recognizing that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is simply refusing to give up on them." The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, with graduating students wiping away tears as they absorbed the implications of Margaret's words. Several faculty members dabbed at their eyes, clearly moved by the combination of clinical wisdom and human compassion that had defined Margaret's approach to healthcare throughout her career. After the ceremony, as they posed for photographs with Dean Phillips and other university officials, Sarah overheard one of the new graduates talking to her parents about Margaret's speech. "She made me understand why I wanted to become a nurse in the first place," the young woman said. "It's not about the science, it's about the love." That evening, back in their renovated kitchen, Margaret and Sarah sat at the same wooden table where they'd shared thousands of meals over the years. Margaret's speech had been live-streamed to nursing schools across the country, and Sarah's laptop showed a steady stream of comments from viewers who'd been inspired by the story of the nurse who'd found family through professional calling. "I never imagined my story would matter to so many people," Margaret said, scrolling through messages from nurses, patients, and families who'd found hope in her example. "All these years, I thought I was just doing my job." "You were never just doing your job," Sarah replied, reaching across the table to squeeze her grandmother's scarred hand. "You were showing the rest of us what love looks like when it's backed up by action, Doctor." Morrison's car pulled into their driveway as the sun set over Cleveland, and Sarah smiled as she watched Margaret check her reflection in the window before answering the door. Love had found Margaret Thornton twice in her 71 years, first in a burning car 23 years ago, and now in the gentle courtship of a fellow healthcare professional who understood both her strength and her vulnerability. As Sarah listened to Margaret and James discussing dinner plans from the front hallway, she realized that their story wasn't ending. It was evolving, expanding to include new possibilities for joy and connection that neither of them had anticipated. The glass that had once threatened to destroy Margaret's life had been transformed into a symbol of resilience, proof that even our deepest wounds could become sources of healing for others. Their chosen family, forged in crisis and sustained by unwavering commitment, had become something beautiful enough to inspire strangers across the country. And that, Sarah thought as she watched her grandmother laugh at something Dr. Morrison said, was perhaps the most extraordinary twist of all.